Alfonso de Albuquerque stands on the deck of his flagship off the coast of Arabia in 1513. He's the governor of Portuguese India, the most powerful European in Asia, and he's reading a letter he's about to send to King Manuel I of Portugal. The letter contains the most audacious military plan of the 16th century. He proposes to sail a fleet into the Red Sea, land forces at the port of Jeddah, march 70 kilometers inland to Mecca, and during the Hajj pilgrimage, when 1 million Muslims are gathered at the Kaaba, he will destroy Islam's holiest site with gunpowder and artillery. But it gets worse, the letter continues. After destroying the Kaaba, he proposes to continue north to Medina, break into the Prophet Muhammad's tomb, steal his body, and hold it for ransom. The price for returning the Prophet's remains, the complete withdrawal of Muslim forces from the Holy Land, and the surrender of Jerusalem to Christian control. He will effectively take the founder of Islam hostage to force the Muslim world to give up everything they fought for since the Crusades. Albuquerque isn't joking. He's deadly serious. He's already conquered Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. He's defeated larger Muslim fleets with smaller Portuguese forces. He commands the most advanced naval technology in the world. And he genuinely believes he can sail into the Red Sea, attack the holiest sites of a religion with hundreds of millions of followers, and succeed. The plan is militarily feasible. The ships are ready. The soldiers are willing. All he needs is the king's approval. This isn't alternate history. This isn't speculation. This actually happened. Portuguese commanders in the early 1500s seriously planned to attack Mecca and destroy the Kaaba. They launched multiple expeditions toward the Red Sea. They fought battles within sight of the Arabian coast. And if a few decisions had gone differently, if weather had been more favorable, if timing had aligned, they might have actually done it. This is the story of how Portugal, a tiny kingdom on the edge of Europe, with barely 1 million people, came within striking distance of triggering the largest religious war in human history, and why, ultimately, the siege of Mecca never happened. Before we dive into the most audacious military plan that almost succeeded, if you enjoy learning about the historical moments where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these near-miss apocalypses together across the world. To understand how Portugal ended up planning to attack Mecca, you need to understand the age of exploration, but not the sanitized version taught in schools. The real version, where European expansion was driven by a toxic combination of religious fanaticism, economic desperation, and genuine military brilliance. Portugal in the late 1400s was poor. It was a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe with terrible agricultural land, no significant natural resources, and a population of maybe 1 million people. It was surrounded by Castile, which would become Spain, a much larger and more powerful kingdom that regularly threatened Portuguese independence. Portugal needed wealth and power, and it needed them fast, or it risked being absorbed by its larger neighbor. The problem was that all the traditional routes to wealth were blocked. The overland trade routes to Asia, the source of spices, silk, and other luxury goods, were controlled by Muslim powers. The Mediterranean trade was dominated by Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. Portugal was shut out of the most profitable commercial networks in the known world. They couldn't compete with established powers using conventional methods, so they decided to circumvent the entire system by sailing around Africa to reach Asia directly. This wasn't just an economic strategy, it was also religious. Portugal was deeply fanatically Catholic. The Portuguese crown and church saw themselves as crusaders, warriors of Christ fighting against Islam. And the fact that Muslim powers controlled the trade routes wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was a theological offense. Muslim merchants were making money from Christian purchases. Muslim states were enriching themselves through taxes on trade that should rightfully belong to Christians. The world was upside down, and Portugal would fix it. The Portuguese strategy, developed over several decades by Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, was elegant in its brutality. Send ships down the African coast, establish fortified trading posts, and eventually find a sea route to India. Once in the Indian Ocean, use superior naval technology to dominate trade, drive out Muslim merchants, and redirect all the wealth of the spice trade through Portuguese-controlled channels. It was economic warfare backed by religious zealotry, and it worked. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. It took 4 ships, 2 years, and incredible hardship, but he made it. The voyage itself was an ordeal that killed more than half his crew. Scurvy, dysentery, storms and conflicts with local populations in East Africa all took their toll. But when da Gama's ships finally reached Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, they'd accomplished what European powers had been trying to do for decades. They'd found a sea route to the Spice Islands, and when da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499 with 2 ships and a fraction of his original crew, but with holds full of pepper, cinnamon, and other spices, King Manuel IV, a single successful voyage could generate profits of several thousand%. Spices that cost pennies in India could be sold for gold in Europe. The economics were so favorable that even if half your ships sank and 3/4 of your crew died, you'd still make enormous profits on the surviving cargo. But they'd also found something else, something that would shape Portuguese strategy for decades. The Indian Ocean was dominated by Muslim trading networks. Arab traders had been sailing between the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia for centuries. Persian merchants controlled much of the shipping in the Persian Gulf. Indian Muslim merchants, particularly the Gujarati traders, dominated commerce along the west coast of India. Everywhere the Portuguese looked, Muslims were wealthy and powerful. This enraged the Portuguese in a way that's difficult to understand if you don't grasp the depth of their religious fanaticism and the historical context of their national identity. Portugal had only recently completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to expel the Moors from Iberia. The last Muslim stronghold in Granada had fallen in 1492, just 6 years before da Gama reached India. The Portuguese had defined their national identity through this struggle against Islam. They saw themselves as crusaders, soldiers of Christ, defenders of Christendom, against the Muslim threat. And now they discover that even on the other side of the world, even in regions they'd thought were untouched by the great religious conflict of the Mediterranean world, Muslims are wealthy, powerful, and controlling the trade that Portugal desperately needs. It felt like a cosmic injustice. They'd sailed halfway around the world to escape Muslim control of trade routes, only to find Muslims already there, already rich, already dominant. So Portugal decided to destroy them, not compete with them on fair terms, not negotiate for market access. Destroy them, remove them from the Indian Ocean entirely. The Portuguese strategy wasn't about finding a place in existing trade networks. It was about conquering those networks, eliminating Muslim competitors, and establishing Portuguese monopoly control. This was total economic warfare justified by religious hatred. The policy was formalized in instructions sent to Portuguese commanders by King Manuel I. Muslim ships were to be seized or sunk, not escorted or taxed. Muslim merchants were to be driven out of ports, not allowed to trade alongside Portuguese merchants. Muslim-ruled ports were to be conquered and their populations converted or expelled, not incorporated into a trading partnership. It was a policy of elimination, not coexistence. And this is where we need to understand just how brutal the implementation of this policy was. Portuguese naval forces in the Indian Ocean operated with a level of violence that shocked even other Europeans who weren't known for their gentleness with non-Christian populations. Venetian and Genoese merchants who occasionally encountered Portuguese forces in Asian waters sent letters back to Europe describing Portuguese actions in terms that suggested they'd lost all moral restraint. The specific tactics Portuguese commanders used become important for understanding why attacking Mecca seemed like a logical extension of their existing strategy rather than a radical departure from it. First, they would establish naval bases by conquering fortified ports. These conquests typically involved bombardment by naval artillery that could destroy walls medieval fortifications weren't designed to withstand, followed by assault by Portuguese soldiers supported by Christian converts and local allies willing to work with the invaders in exchange for a share of plunder. Once a port was captured, the pattern was remarkably consistent. All Muslim officials and military commanders were executed immediately, usually by beheading or hanging, with the bodies displayed publicly. Wealthy Muslim merchants were given the choice of conversion to Christianity or death, though many who converted were killed anyway on suspicion of being insincere. The general Muslim population was forcibly converted, expelled, or in some cases massacred, depending on the strategic importance of the location and the temperament of the Portuguese commander. Christian converts, particularly those who accepted Portuguese authority early, were rewarded with property confiscated from Muslims. This created a class of collaborators who had a vested interest in Portuguese success and who could be relied upon to inform on resistance movements and help maintain control. These converts were often from lower castes or economically disadvantaged groups who saw Portuguese rule as an opportunity for social advancement at the expense of the existing Muslim elites. The second part of the Portuguese strategy was even more brutal. Naval patrols would hunt down Muslim trading vessels throughout the Indian Ocean. When a Muslim ship was encountered, Portuguese commanders rarely offered the option of surrender. They would simply attack with naval artillery, dismast the ship to prevent escape, then close for boarding. The cargo would be seized. The crew would typically be killed, either immediately by sword or by being thrown overboard. The ship itself would be burned, because Portuguese commanders wanted to physically reduce the number of Muslim vessels capable of carrying trade. The reasoning was purely economic. Every Muslim ship destroyed was one less competitor. Every Muslim merchant killed was one less person competing for the spice trade. Portuguese commanders understood that they couldn't compete with established Muslim trading networks on equal terms. Muslims knew the markets, spoke the languages, had existing relationships with suppliers and buyers. So rather than compete, Portugal eliminated the competition through systematic violence. But the violence wasn't just strategic, it was also performative and ideological. Portuguese commanders wanted Muslim merchants and sailors to be terrified of Portuguese forces. They wanted stories of Portuguese brutality to spread throughout the Indian Ocean so that Muslim traders would abandon the sea lanes and Portuguese ships could operate without competition. Terror was a weapon as important as cannons. This leads to specific incidents that demonstrate just how far Portuguese commanders were willing to go. The burning of the Miri in 1502, which I mentioned earlier, wasn't unique. It was one incident among many, notable only because some survivors managed to reach shore and their account was recorded by Arab historians. But similar burnings happened repeatedly throughout the early 1500s, and this is where we need to stop and correct a massive misconception about the age of exploration. In popular imagination, European expansion is often depicted as brave explorers discovering new lands and establishing trade relationships. The reality was far more violent. Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean was a military conquest backed by technological superiority and justified by religious hatred. The Portuguese had several critical advantages. First, their ships were better. Portuguese carracks and caravels were designed for ocean voyages. They could handle rough seas that would swamp the dhows and junks that dominated Indian Ocean trade. Second, their cannons were better. Portuguese ships carried heavy artillery that could sink enemy vessels from distances where the enemy couldn't effectively return fire. Third, their tactics were more aggressive. Portuguese commanders would attack even when outnumbered because they knew their technological advantages would compensate for numerical inferiority. But most importantly, Portuguese commanders were willing to commit atrocities that shocked even their contemporaries. They would capture Muslim trading vessels and burn the crew alive. They would bombard port cities and slaughter civilians. They would mutilate prisoners and send them back as warnings. This wasn't just military necessity. This was deliberate terror, designed to break the will of their opponents. The architect of this strategy was Afonso de Albuquerque, who became governor of Portuguese India in 1509. He was a military genius, a religious fanatic, and one of the most brutal colonial administrators in history. He understood that Portugal didn't have the population or resources to conquer and hold large territories in Asia. So instead, he focused on controlling strategic choke points, capture the ports that controlled trade routes, fortify them heavily, use naval power to dominate the sea lanes, force all trade through Portuguese-controlled channels, and tax it heavily. In 1510, Albuquerque conquered Goa on the west coast of India. He didn't just capture it, he massacred the Muslim population. Thousands of men, women, and children were killed in systematic purges. Portuguese soldiers went house to house, executing anyone who looked Muslim or refused to convert to Christianity. Albuquerque wanted Goa to be a Portuguese city, not a conquered Indian city with Portuguese rulers. So he eliminated the existing population and replaced them with Portuguese settlers and Christian converts. In 1511, he conquered Malacca, one of the most important trading ports in Southeast Asia. Again, the conquest was followed by massacres of Muslim merchants and officials. In 1515, he conquered Hormuz, controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Each conquest followed the same pattern: overwhelming naval firepower, capture of the port, execution of Muslim leadership, installation of Portuguese garrisons, and forced conversion or expulsion of the remaining population. By 1513, Albuquerque controlled a network of fortified ports that gave Portugal dominance over Indian Ocean trade. Muslim merchants who'd controlled trade for centuries were being driven out of business. Muslim sultanates that had ruled coastal regions for generations were paying tribute to Portugal. The wealth of the spice trade was being redirected through Portuguese channels to Lisbon. Portugal, a tiny European kingdom, was becoming rich beyond the dreams of its monarchs. But Albuquerque wasn't satisfied. Military success and economic profit weren't enough. He wanted something more. He wanted to strike at the heart of Islam itself. He wanted to humiliate the Muslim world so completely, so utterly, that they would never recover. And he'd identified the perfect target: Mecca. Mecca wasn't just a city, it was the spiritual center of Islam. Every Muslim on earth prayed facing Mecca 5 times a day. Every Muslim who could afford it was obligated to make the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. The Kaaba, a tube-shaped building in the center of Mecca's Grand Mosque, was the holiest site in Islam. Muslims believed it was built by Abraham and was the house of God on earth. Destroying the Kaaba would be the ultimate act of religious warfare, and Albuquerque believed he could do it. He'd studied the geography. Mecca was only 70 kilometers inland from the Red Sea port of Jeddah. That was less than a week's march for a military force. The city wasn't heavily fortified. It didn't have significant military defenses because nobody had ever seriously tried to attack it. It was protected by its remoteness and by the universal agreement that attacking the holiest site of a major religion was unthinkable. But Albuquerque wasn't constrained by normal thinking. He'd already committed atrocities that shocked contemporary observers. Attacking Mecca was just taking his strategy to its logical conclusion. The plan, as outlined in his letters to King Manuel I and in correspondence with other Portuguese commanders, was elaborate but militarily feasible given 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 Portuguese commanders. The plan had multiple stages, each of which Albuquerque had carefully thought through, based on his experience conquering other fortified positions. First stage: assemble an invasion fleet of 20-30 ships. This wasn't an arbitrary number. Albuquerque calculated that 20 ships could carry about 3,000 Portuguese soldiers plus artillery, supplies and equipment for an extended campaign. 30 ships would provide redundancy in case some were lost to storms or combat. The fleet would include carracks for carrying troops and supplies, smaller caravels for scouting and shallow water operations, and perhaps a few galleons for heavy naval combat if they encountered Ottoman or Mamluk fleets. The ships would need to be prepared specifically for Red Sea operations. This meant ensuring they had experienced pilots who understood coral reef navigation, carrying extra anchors and rope in case they needed to warp through difficult passages, and stockpiling enough food and water for several months at sea with no opportunity to resupply. Albuquerque had already identified potential staging points along the Arabian coast where Portuguese forces could stop to take on water before the final approach to Jeddah. Second stage: navigate the Red Sea. This was one of the most dangerous parts of the plan. The Red Sea was notorious for unpredictable winds, strong currents and treacherous coral reefs that could rip open a ship's hull if the pilot didn't know exactly where the deep channels were. European ships had almost no experience in these waters. The few attempts by Portuguese and Venetian vessels had often ended in disaster, with ships grounded on reefs or driven onto shore by sudden wind shifts. But Albuquerque had been gathering intelligence about Red Sea navigation for years. He interrogated every captured Muslim sailor who'd sailed those waters. He purchased or seized Arabic maritime charts from captured ships. An attack during pilgrimage would mean every Muslim community would have personal connections to the victims. It would make the atrocity personal and immediate in a way that attacking an empty city couldn't achieve. Moreover, attacking during Hajj would maximize the symbolic impact. The Hajj rituals included circumambulating the Kaaba, the most sacred act in Islam. Portuguese forces destroying the Kaaba while pilgrims performed these rituals, would be the ultimate religious desecration, a violation so profound that Muslims would remember it for generations. Albuquerque understood psychological warfare. He wanted to break Muslim morale so completely that they would lose the will to resist Portuguese expansion. Fifth stage, march inland to Mecca. This was the most dangerous military operation in the plan, 70 kilometers through hostile territory and desert heat, with a supply line stretching back to Jeddah. The march would take 4 to 5 days for an army moving with artillery and supplies. They would be vulnerable to guerrilla attacks from local tribes and whatever military forces the Sharif of Mecca could assemble. Water would be scarce, heat exhaustion would be a constant threat. But Albuquerque had studied the terrain using intelligence gathered from captured sailors and merchants who'd made the pilgrimage. He knew there were wells along the caravan routes. He knew the terrain was mostly flat desert that wouldn't provide cover for large-scale ambushes. He knew that local military forces in the Hijaz region were poorly organized compared to Portuguese soldiers who'd fought in dozens of sieges and battles with proper preparation and disciplined marching. He believed 3,000 Portuguese soldiers could reach Mecca and overcome whatever resistance they encountered. Sixth stage, besiege and bombard Mecca. Once Portuguese forces surrounded the city, they would set up artillery positions and begin systematic destruction. Albuquerque planned to target the Grand Mosque first, using heavy cannons to demolish its walls and minarets. The Kaaba itself, being a relatively small stone structure, would be particularly vulnerable to artillery fire. A few direct hits from a heavy cannon firing stone balls weighing several hundred pounds would reduce it to rubble. The bombardment would continue for as long as necessary to break any organized resistance and create enough destruction to achieve the mission's objectives. Albuquerque estimated 2 to 3 days of constant shelling would be sufficient. Portuguese soldiers would then assault the city, moving street by street to eliminate any remaining defenders. Pilgrims who tried to flee would be hunted down. Those who surrendered would be held as prisoners initially, though Albuquerque's letters suggest he intended to execute most of them later to prevent them from reorganizing resistance. Seventh stage, systematically destroy Islamic holy sites. This went beyond just military conquest. Albuquerque wanted to physically erase the structures Muslims venerated. After capturing the Grand Mosque, Portuguese engineers would plant gunpowder charges at the foundations of the remaining structures and blow them up. The rubble would be scattered. If possible, Portuguese soldiers would dig up the ground where the Kaaba had stood to ensure nothing remained that Muslims could rally around as a rebuilt holy site. This was cultural genocide, deliberately destroying the physical manifestations of Islamic faith. Eighth stage massacre pilgrims. Albuquerque's letters are explicit about this. He didn't intend to take prisoners for ransom or allow pilgrims to leave peacefully after witnessing the destruction. He ordered that pilgrims be killed systematically. The goal was to maximize casualties among Muslims from every region of the Islamic world, ensuring that news of the atrocity would spread everywhere. Portuguese soldiers would hunt down pilgrims trying to escape into the desert. They would search buildings for hidden refugees. They would be thorough and merciless. Ninth stage, continue to Medina. With Mecca destroyed, Albuquerque planned to march the army north to Medina, Islam's second holiest city. Medina was where Prophet Muhammad was buried. The tomb was housed in a structure called the Prophet's Mosque, which had become a major pilgrimage site. Albuquerque proposed to break into the mosque, locate the Prophet's tomb, open it, and steal the remains. This wasn't random desecration. It was strategic hostage-taking. With the Prophet's physical remains in Portuguese custody, Albuquerque believed he could dictate terms to the entire Muslim world. He would threaten to destroy the remains, to burn them, to throw them into the sea, unless Muslim rulers agreed to his demands. He specifically wanted the complete withdrawal of Muslim forces from the Holy Land and the surrender of Jerusalem to Christian control. Essentially, he wanted to reverse 3 centuries of Muslim control over territories Christians considered rightfully theirs. 10th stage, retreat to Jeddah and return to Portuguese India. After accomplishing these objectives, Portuguese forces would march back to Jeddah with their captives and stolen relics, board their ships, and sail back through the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Albuquerque acknowledged this would be the most dangerous phase because Muslim forces would be hunting them. Ottoman and Mamluk fleets would be mobilized. Arab tribes would attack supply lines. The Portuguese fleet would need to fight its way back through the Red Sea while protecting the Prophet's remains and whatever prisoners they'd taken, but Albuquerque believed the risk was worth it. If the plan succeeded, if Portuguese forces destroyed the Kaaba and captured the Prophet's body, Portugal would have leverage over the entire Muslim world. They could demand concessions, territorial surrenders, commercial treaties, whatever they wanted, and if Muslim rulers refused, Portugal could threaten further attacks on Islamic holy sites. With naval superiority in the Indian Ocean, Portuguese forces could return to the Red Sea anytime they wanted. The threat would be perpetual. The plan was detailed, carefully thought out, and based on realistic assessments of Portuguese military capabilities and the strategic situation in Arabia. It wasn't fantasy, it was a serious military proposal, developed by one of the most successful commanders in Portuguese history. A man who'd already conquered multiple fortified cities against larger forces. If Albuquerque had received approval from King Manuel, and if circumstances had aligned favorably, the plan might very well have been executed. The first problem Albuquerque faced was the Red Sea itself. The Red Sea is one of the most difficult bodies of water to navigate in the world. It's long and narrow, stretching about 1,200 miles from the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the strait in the south to the Gulf of Suez in the north. The winds are unpredictable. The currents are treacherous, and most dangerously, the sea is full of coral reefs that can tear open a ship's hull if the navigator doesn't know exactly where they are. European ships had never sailed the Red Sea in any numbers. The Ottoman Empire and Mamluk Egypt controlled the northern end. Various Arab sheiks controlled the coasts. The entire region was hostile to Christian presence. Any Portuguese fleet entering the Red Sea would be sailing into unknown waters with no reliable maps, for knowledge of safe anchorages, and no possibility of resupply if things went wrong. It was extraordinarily risky even by the standards of Portuguese exploration, but Albuquerque was convinced it was possible. He'd obtained information from captured Muslim sailors and merchants about Red Sea navigation. He'd interrogated Christian slaves who'd been taken from European ships and forced to serve on Muslim vessels. He'd studied Arabic maritime charts. He believed he had enough intelligence to attempt the voyage, and in 1513, he began preparing a fleet for a reconnaissance expedition toward the Red Sea. The expedition was commanded by one of Albuquerque's most trusted officers and consisted of several ships with orders to explore the southern Red Sea, map the coastline, identify potential landing sites for a larger invasion force, and if possible, capture Jeddah, or at least assess its defenses. It was supposed to be reconnaissance, not a full invasion, but Portuguese commanders had a tendency to exceed their orders when they smelled opportunity. The fleet made it as far as the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and there they encountered a problem nobody had anticipated. An Ottoman Egyptian fleet was patrolling the strait. The Mamluks, who ruled Egypt at the time, had received intelligence about Portuguese intentions. They knew the Portuguese were interested in the Red Sea. They knew about the attacks on Muslim shipping in the Indian Ocean, and they'd positioned a fleet to block any Portuguese attempt to enter the Red Sea. The resulting naval battle was inconclusive. The Portuguese had better ships and cannons. The Mamluks had more ships and knowledge of local waters. Both sides inflicted casualties, but neither achieved a decisive victory. The Portuguese commander, faced with an alert enemy, damaged ships, and the knowledge that he was far from any friendly port, decided to withdraw. The reconnaissance expedition returned to Portuguese India without entering the Red Sea proper. Albuquerque was furious, but not discouraged. He'd proven it was possible to reach the entrance to the Red Sea. The next expedition would be larger, better prepared, and more aggressive. He began planning a full-scale invasion fleet, assembling ships, recruiting soldiers, and gathering supplies, but he faced opposition from an unexpected source. King Manuel the King had received Albuquerque's letters describing the plan to attack Mecca and steal the Prophet's body, and Manuel's reaction was complicated. On one hand, he was a devout Catholic who'd expelled Jews from Portugal and supported the Inquisition. He hated Muslims as enemies of Christianity. The idea of striking at the heart of Islam appealed to his religious fanaticism. On the other hand, he was a king responsible for a small kingdom with limited resources, and he could do basic math. Portugal had maybe 1 million people. the Muslim world had at least 100 million. If Portugal attacked Mecca, the response wouldn't be limited to the Indian Ocean. Every Muslim ruler from Morocco to Indonesia would declare war on Portugal. Muslim armies would attack Portuguese territories in North Africa. Muslim fleets would raid Portuguese shipping. Muslim merchants would embargo Portuguese trade. Portugal would face a global war against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. Even if the attack on Mecca succeeded militarily, the strategic consequences could destroy Portugal. The kingdom's wealth came from trade. If that trade was cut off by a Muslim embargo and counter-blockade, Portugal's economy would collapse. The fortified ports in the Indian Ocean could be isolated and starved into surrender. Portuguese ships at sea would be hunted by every Muslim naval force on earth. It would be catastrophic. King Manuel sent letters to Albuquerque with mixed messages. He praised Albuquerque's zeal and ambition. He acknowledged the religious merit of attacking Islam's holiest sites. But he also urged caution. He suggested that perhaps a less provocative strategy might be more sustainable. Maybe focus on controlling trade rather than destroying religious sites. Maybe avoid triggering a global religious war that Portugal couldn't win. Albuquerque interpreted these letters as bureaucratic timidity. He believed the king lacked the vision to understand what was possible. He continued planning the Red Sea expedition, convinced that once it succeeded, the king would see the wisdom of his strategy. This was the mindset of a man who'd conquered half a dozen fortified cities against impossible odds. He believed his will and his faith could overcome any obstacle. But fate intervened. In December 1515, Afonso de Albuquerque died from illness in Goa. He was 62 years old, worn out from decades of warfare and tropical diseases. His last letters still contained plans for the Red Sea expedition. He died believing it would happen, that his successor would carry out his vision. The Mecca would fall to Portuguese artillery, and the Muslim world would be forced to its knees. His successor as governor of Portuguese India was Leopoldo Soares de Albugaria, a competent administrator, but not a visionary fanatic like Albuquerque. Albugaria looked at the plan to attack Mecca and made a rational calculation. The risks vastly outweighed the potential rewards. Even if the attack succeeded, the consequences would be catastrophic for Portuguese interests. Better to focus on consolidating what they already controlled rather than gambling everything on a grandiose scheme. The plan to attack Mecca was quietly shelved. The ships that had been prepared were redirected to other missions. The soldiers who'd volunteered for the expedition were assigned to garrison duty in existing Portuguese forts. The Red Sea expeditions continued in limited form, mostly reconnaissance and occasional raids on small ports, but nothing approaching the full-scale invasion. Alba's small ports, but nothing approaching the full-scale invasion. But the story doesn't end there. Because while the Portuguese ultimately didn't attack Mecca, they continued to operate in the Red Sea region for decades, and some of their actions came dangerously close to triggering the religious war that King Manuel feared. In 1517, just 2 years after Albuquerque's death, a Portuguese fleet did enter the Red Sea. It was commanded by Leopoldo Soares de Albugaria himself, who had apparently overcome his initial caution. The fleet consisted of about 20 ships carrying artillery and several thousand soldiers. The stated objective was to explore commercial opportunities and establish a Portuguese presence in the region. The unstated objective was probably to assess whether Albuquerque's plan was still feasible. The fleet sailed up the Red Sea, mapping the coastline, identifying anchorages, and occasionally raiding small coastal settlements. They got as far north as the port of Jeddah, within striking distance of Mecca. Portuguese commanders landed soldiers on the coast within sight of Jeddah's fortifications. They could see the city. They could see the roads leading inland toward Mecca. They were closer to attacking Islam's holiest site than any Christian army had been since the time of Muhammad. And then they encountered another problem. The Ottomans. By 1517, the Ottoman Empire had conquered Mamluk Egypt and taken control of the Red Sea coast. Unlike the Mamluks, who'd been weakened by internal conflicts and economic problems, the Ottomans were at the height of their power. Sultan Selim the Fayyid had just defeated the Safavid Persians and annexed Egypt. The Ottoman Empire now stretched from the Balkans to the Indian Ocean, and they took the Portuguese presence in the Red Sea very seriously. Ottoman intelligence networks had informed Sultan Selim about Portuguese activities in the Indian Ocean. They knew about the attacks on Muslim shipping. They knew about the conquests of Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. They knew about Albuquerque's letters proposing to attack Mecca, and they knew that Portuguese ships were now sailing in the Red Sea, approaching the holy cities. This was unacceptable. Selim ordered the construction of a Red Sea fleet, specifically to counter the Portuguese threat. Egyptian shipyards that had been neglected under the Mamluks were reactivated. Timber was imported from Anatolia. Cannons were cast in Ottoman foundries. Experienced naval officers were transferred from the Mediterranean fleet. Within months, the Ottomans had assembled a fleet of galleys specifically designed to operate in the Red Sea and drive out the Portuguese. The resulting naval battles in 1517 and 1518 were some of the most intense of the early modern period. Portuguese carracks with heavy artillery faced Ottoman galleys with skilled crews and local knowledge. The battles were fought in coral reef-infested waters where neither side could maneuver freely. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Ships were sunk, crews drowned. Artillery duels continued for hours with neither side gaining decisive advantage. But ultimately, the Ottomans won through attrition. They had the ability to build more ships in Egyptian shipyards. They had larger reserves of manpower. They could resupply their fleets from ports along the Red Sea coast. The Portuguese, operating thousands of miles from their nearest base, couldn't sustain long-term naval operations in the Red Sea. After several battles that cost them ships and men they couldn't afford to lose, the Portuguese fleet withdrew from the Red Sea. Portuguese commanders tried several more times to establish a permanent presence in the Red Sea over the next few decades. Small squadrons would sail up from the Indian Ocean, raid coastal settlements, fight running battles with Ottoman galleys, and then withdraw when supplies ran low or casualties mounted. But they never again came as close to threatening Mecca as they did in 1517 when Portuguese soldiers landed within sight of Jeddah. The strategic situation had changed. In the early 1500s, when Albuquerque was planning his expeditions, the Red Sea region was defended by the declining Mamluk Sultanate. By the 1520s, it was defended by the Ottoman Empire at the peak of its power. The window of opportunity, if it had ever existed, had closed. The Portuguese could dominate the wider Indian Ocean, but they couldn't penetrate the Red Sea in force. Mecca was safe, or was it? Because there's another chapter to this story that's even more disturbing than Albuquerque's plans. In the 1530s and 1540s, Portuguese commanders in the Indian Ocean received letters from Christian allies in Ethiopia. The letters proposed a joint Christian-Portuguese invasion of the Arabian Peninsula. Ethiopia would attack from the east, across the Red Sea. Portugal would attack from the south, through the Indian Ocean. They would coordinate their assaults on Jeddah and Mecca, divide the spoils, and together destroy Islam's holiest sites. These weren't just fantasy proposals. The Ethiopian Empire, also known as Abyssinia, was a Christian kingdom that had survived surrounded by Muslim powers for centuries. The Ethiopians had their own grievances against their Muslim neighbors. Wars had been fought. Territories had been lost and regained. The Ethiopians saw Portugal as a potential ally in their ongoing conflicts, and they knew that Portuguese commanders had religious motives that might align with the Ethiopian interests. Portuguese commanders in India took these proposals seriously enough to send diplomatic missions to Ethiopia. Portuguese envoys traveled to the Ethiopian court. They met with the Ethiopian emperor. They discussed military plans. They identified potential landing sites on the Arabian coast. They talked about coordinating attacks and sharing intelligence. It was real diplomatic and military planning, not just wishful thinking, but again, nothing came of it. The logistics were overwhelming. Ethiopia couldn't project naval power across the Red Sea in sufficient strength to support a major invasion. Portugal couldn't coordinate with an ally thousands of miles away with no reliable means of communication, and both sides ultimately concluded that attacking Mecca would provoke a response from the entire Muslim world that neither Ethiopia nor Portugal could survive. So the siege of Mecca never happened, but not because it was impossible. It almost happened, several times. Portuguese commanders came close enough to see Jeddah's walls. They mapped the route to Mecca. They knew the distances, the terrain, the likely defenses. They had the ships and the artillery and the soldiers willing to attempt it. What stopped them wasn't military impossibility. It was strategic calculation, and ultimately the realization that even if they succeeded militarily, they would lose strategically. And this is where the story takes its dark turn, because while Portugal ultimately didn't attack Mecca, their actions in the Indian Ocean continued to be catastrophic for Muslim populations. The Portuguese policy of destroying Muslim shipping, burning Muslim trading vessels, and executing Muslim sailors didn't stop. It intensified. For decades, Portuguese naval forces committed what we would now call crimes against humanity on a routine basis. One of the most horrific incidents occurred in 1502, even before Albuquerque became governor. Portuguese commander Vasco da Gama, the same explorer who'd found the route to India, captured a Muslim pilgrim ship returning from Mecca. The ship was called the Miri, and it carried about 400 men, women, and children, including wealthy merchants and their families. Da Gama demanded they surrender their cargo. They complied. Then, he demanded ransom for the passengers. They offered to pay. Then he changed his mind and decided to burn the ship with everyone on board. The passengers begged for mercy. They offered more money. They offered to convert to Christianity. They showed him their children and pleaded for their lives. Da Gama ordered the ship set on fire anyway. Portuguese sailors blocked the exits, so nobody could escape. 400 people burned alive, while Da Gama's crew watched. The screaming lasted for hours. Survivors who managed to jump into the ocean were shot with crossbows or left to drown. Only a handful survived to tell the story. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard Portuguese policy. Muslim ships were routinely captured and burned with their crews and passengers. The Portuguese didn't discriminate between military targets and civilians. Everyone was an enemy. Everyone deserved death. This was religious warfare taken to its most extreme conclusion. Another incident occurred in 1509 at the Battle of Dio. Portuguese forces defeated a combined Muslim fleet that included Egyptian, Gujarati, and Ottoman ships. After the battle, Portuguese commanders executed all prisoners, throwing them overboard with weights tied to their feet. Hundreds of men drowned. The Portuguese commander, Francisco de Almeida, justified this by claiming that Muslims didn't deserve quarter because they were enemies of Christ. Nobody in the Portuguese command structure questioned this logic. These atrocities created immense hatred toward Portugal throughout the Muslim world. Portuguese sailors captured by Muslims could expect no mercy because they'd shown none. Torture and execution of Portuguese prisoners became standard practice. It was a cycle of violence that escalated with each incident, and it could have gotten much worse if Portugal had actually attacked Mecca. Because here's what would have happened if Albuquerque's plan had succeeded. And we need to think through this scenario in detail, because it helps us understand why King Manuel ultimately rejected it, despite his religious fanaticism. Imagine Portuguese forces capturing Mecca in 1514-15. Imagine them destroying the Kaaba during Hajj. Imagine them killing tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in the Grand Mosque and surrounding areas. Imagine them continuing to Medina and desecrating the Prophet's tomb. The response would have been immediate, overwhelming, and sustained across decades. Every Muslim ruler from Morocco to Indonesia would have declared total war on Portugal within weeks of receiving news of the attack. This wouldn't be symbolic declarations. This would be full military mobilization, with the explicit goal of destroying Portuguese power completely. The Sultan of Morocco, who controlled territories bordering Portuguese North African holdings, would have immediately invaded. Portuguese fortresses in Tangier, Ceuta, and other North African ports would have been besieged by Moroccan forces with popular support that would have made resistance nearly impossible. The Ottoman Empire, at this point still consolidating control over Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, would have redirected massive resources from its European campaigns to focus exclusively on destroying Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. Sultan Selim I, who just conquered Egypt and was planning campaigns against Hungary and Persia, would have made the destruction of Portugal his primary strategic objective. The Ottoman treasury would have funded a massive naval buildup in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Ottoman shipyards in Egypt, Syria, and Basra would have worked at maximum capacity to build war galleys specifically designed to hunt Portuguese ships. The Safavid Persians, usually bitter enemies of the Ottomans due to religious differences between Sunni and Shia Islam, would have put aside their conflicts to focus on the common Christian enemy. Persian forces would have attacked Portuguese positions in the Persian Gulf. The fortress at Hormuz which controlled a strategic strait connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean, would have faced sustained siege from Persian armies, supported by Persian naval forces. Without the ability to supply or reinforce Hormuz, Portuguese control of this critical choke point would have collapsed. In India, every Muslim sultanate from Gujarat to Bengal would have mobilized their forces against Portuguese holdings. The Sultanate of Gujarat, one of the wealthiest and most powerful Muslim states in India, would have laid siege to Portuguese Goa with overwhelming force. Gujarati forces had already attempted to retake Goa several times since its capture in 1510, but they'd been disunited and Portuguese defenses had held. After an attack on Mecca, Gujarati Muslim rulers would have had popular support and religious justification for total war. The siege of Goa would have become a religious crusade, with volunteers from across the Muslim world joining the assault. The Sultanate of Bijapur, the Bahmani Sultanate, and other regional Muslim powers in southern and central India would have coordinated attacks on Portuguese supply lines and isolated forts. Portuguese forces, which had maintained control through a combination of superior naval technology and exploiting divisions between Indian rulers, would have faced united opposition. Every port where Portuguese merchants operated would have expelled them. Every alliance with local rulers would have collapsed. Portuguese traders would have been arrested or executed throughout Asia. In Southeast Asia, the Sultan of Malacca, who'd been displaced when Albuquerque conquered the city in 1511, would have returned with massive military support from other Muslim states in the region. The Sultan of Aceh, one of the most powerful Muslim rulers in maritime Southeast Asia, would have provided naval forces and soldiers. Combined Muslim fleets from across the Indonesian archipelago would have converged on Portuguese Malacca, besieging it by land and sea. Cut off from resupply and facing overwhelming enemy forces, the Portuguese garrison in Malacca would have eventually fallen, but the military response would have been just one dimension of the catastrophe facing Portugal. The economic consequences would have been equally devastating. Muslim merchants throughout Asia would have implemented a total embargo on trade with Portuguese-controlled ports. No Muslim merchant would sell goods to Portuguese traders. No Muslim shipowner would transport goods for Portuguese companies. No Muslim banker would finance Portuguese commercial ventures. The entire Asian trading system that Portugal depended on for its wealth would have shut them out completely. This matters because Portuguese control of the spice trade was never total. Portuguese forces controlled some key ports and could extract tribute from some trade routes, but they never monopolized Asian commerce. Most spices, silk, and other valuable goods still moved through networks Portuguese didn't control. Muslim merchants could simply redirect trade away from Portuguese-controlled channels, selling to Ottoman, Persian, and other non-Portuguese buyers. Within a year or two of an attack on Mecca, Portuguese commercial revenues from Asia would have collapsed. The financial impact would have cascaded back to Portugal itself. The kingdom's economy had become increasingly dependent on Asian trade revenues. The crown used profits from the spice trade to fund government operations, pay for European wars, and maintain the nobility support. Without those revenues, King Manuel would have faced a fiscal crisis. He'd be unable to pay soldiers in North Africa, unable to fund naval expeditions, unable to maintain the network of fortified ports that Portuguese power depended on. The economic foundation of Portuguese imperial expansion would have crumbled. In Europe, Portugal would have faced diplomatic isolation even from other Christian powers. Yes, European kingdoms were Christian, and many had their own grievances with Muslim powers, but they also had pragmatic interests. Venice traded extensively with Ottoman territories. French kings sometimes allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs. England sought commercial opportunities wherever they could find them. None of these powers would have supported Portugal in a war that Portugal started through what even other Christians would have considered an unjustifiable atrocity. Attacking Mecca during Hajj, killing hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, and desecrating the Prophet's tomb would have horrified many European Christians. Even as it might have pleased religious fanatics, the Pope might have issued a statement supporting Portugal's crusading spirit, but he wouldn't have provided military aid. Spain, Portugal's neighbor and rival, might have publicly supported Portugal while privately hoping Portuguese territories. France and England would have remained neutral or even opportunistically supported Muslim powers against Portugal if it served. And then there's the question of what would have happened to Portugal itself. with Portuguese military forces committed to holding isolated fortresses in Asia and North Africa, with Portuguese revenues collapsing due to trade disruption, with Portuguese enemies mobilized for total war, Spain would have had an unprecedented opportunity. The Spanish kingdoms had only recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella. They'd completed the Reconquista the same year Columbus reached the Americas. They were ambitious, expansionist, and perfectly positioned to absorb Portugal if it weakened sufficiently. Spanish forces could have invaded Portugal from the east. With Portuguese military resources stretched thin across multiple continents, Portugal wouldn't have had sufficient forces to defend the homeland. Spanish armies could have occupied Lisbon within weeks. King Manuel might have fled to Portuguese holdings in Brazil or the Atlantic Islands, becoming a king in exile, ruling over a scattered colonial empire with no metropolitan base. Or he might have been captured and forced to accept Spanish rule in exchange for his life. Portugal could literally have ceased to exist as an independent kingdom within 5 to 10 years of attacking Mecca. The entire Portuguese colonial empire, already under overwhelming military pressure from Muslim forces, would have fragmented. Some forts might have held out for a while, but cut off from support and facing determined sieges, they would have eventually surrendered or been overrun. Portuguese soldiers and settlers would have been killed or enslaved. Portuguese colonial power would have been erased from Asia. King Manuel I and his advisors understood this. That's why they ultimately rejected Albuquerque's plan. Despite their religious fanaticism, they could do math. They could see that short-term religious satisfaction would lead to long-term national suicide. Albuquerque, brilliant as he was militarily, couldn't see past his religious zealotry. He genuinely believed that God would ensure Portuguese victory regardless of the odds. He believed faith could overcome material reality. He was wrong. But the fact that we're discussing what might have happened if Portugal attacked Mecca means we need to confront the reality that it very nearly did happen. This wasn't a fantasy. This wasn't alternative history. This was a real military plan, developed by experienced commanders, supported by significant resources, which came within literally miles of execution. Portuguese soldiers landed on the Arabian coast within sight of Jeddah. They had maps showing the route to Mecca. They had artillery capable of demolishing the Kaaba. They had the will to carry out the plan. All that stopped them was strategic calculation and the presence of Ottoman naval forces. And this is why we don't make movies about the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. The story is too dark, too morally indefensible, too uncomfortable for modern audiences. Yes, Portuguese explorers were brave and skilled sailors who accomplished remarkable feats of navigation and shipbuilding. Yes, they established a global trading network that connected continents. Yes, they laid the foundations for the globalized economy we live in today. But they also committed atrocities on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. They burned ships full of pilgrims. They planned to destroy one of the world's holiest religious sites during a pilgrimage when millions of innocent people would be present. And they did all of this while claiming to act in the name of God and Christian civilization. The Portuguese experience in the Indian Ocean shows what happens when religious fanaticism combines with technological superiority and economic desperation. It creates a mindset where anything becomes justifiable. Burning civilians alive becomes acceptable because they're enemies of your religion. Planning to destroy holy sites becomes reasonable military strategy because it might give you leverage. Genocide becomes policy because it's economically advantageous. Albuquerque wasn't an aberration. He wasn't a rogue commander operating outside normal Portuguese policy. He was the architect of Portuguese strategy in Asia. His tactics were approved by the king and the church. His atrocities were celebrated in Lisbon as victories for Christianity. His plan to attack Mecca was seriously considered at the highest levels of Portuguese government. He represented mainstream Portuguese thinking in the early 1500s, and yet, history remembers him as a great explorer and empire builder. This selective memory itself is worth examining in detail because it reveals how colonial powers have constructed narratives that erase or minimize atrocities while celebrating territorial conquest and economic exploratives. There are statues of Albuquerque in Lisbon, prominent monuments in public squares where Portuguese people walk past them daily without thinking about what Albuquerque actually did. Streets are named after him throughout Portugal and former Portuguese colonies. Schools teach Portuguese children about Albuquerque as a hero who expanded Portuguese power across Asia. The standard Portuguese historical narrative presents Albuquerque as a brilliant military strategist who secured Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean through superior tactics and bold decision-making. His conquests of Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz are taught as great achievements. His establishment of the Estado de India, the network of Portuguese forts and trading posts stretching from East Africa to Japan, is presented as evidence of Portuguese maritime prowess and civilizational superiority. Textbooks emphasize his intelligence, his courage, and his unwavering service to the Portuguese crown and Catholic Church. The atrocities are mentioned, if at all, as unfortunate excesses typical of the time period. The massacres in Goa are described as harsh measures necessary to establish Portuguese control. The plan to attack Mecca is either omitted entirely or mentioned briefly as an ambitious proposal that was never executed, without detailing what execution would have meant. The systematic religious cleansing, the torture of prisoners, the burning of civilians, all of this is sanitized or ignored. This selective memory isn't unique to Portugal. Every European colonial power has done the same with their own brutal colonizers. The British celebrate Cecil Rhodes while minimizing his role in South African apartheid and exploitation. The French commemorate Jules Ferry while downplaying his advocacy for the ruthless suppression of colonial populations. The Belgians took decades to even begin critically examining King Leopold II's genocidal rule in the Congo. The Dutch teach children about Jan Pieter Zoon Koen as a founding father of Dutch colonial success, while barely mentioning the massacres he ordered in Indonesia. But the Portuguese case is particularly striking because Portuguese colonial rule lasted longer than that of most other European powers. Portugal didn't lose most of its colonies until the 1970s, 5 centuries after Albuquerque. This means Portuguese national identity remained tied to colonial empire longer than British or French identity did. When Britain granted independence to India in 1947, it marked the beginning of the end of British colonialism. When France granted independence to Algeria in 1962, it signaled the collapse of French colonialism. But Portugal fought colonial wars in Africa until 1974, defending Portuguese rule in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau against independence movements. Portuguese dictator António de Oliveira Salazar, who ruled from 1932 to 1968, based his regime's legitimacy partly on maintaining the Portuguese Empire. He called the colonies overseas provinces and insisted they were integral parts of Portugal, not separate territories. This required constructing a historical narrative where Portuguese colonialism was fundamentally different from, and morally superior to, other forms of European colonialism. Salazar's regime promoted the idea of Lusotropicalism, the theory that Portuguese colonizers were uniquely humane because they mixed with local populations and supposedly didn't practice racial discrimination. This theory was propaganda, contradicted by the reality of Portuguese colonial rule, but it became embedded in Portuguese national consciousness. To maintain this myth of benevolent colonialism, the regime had to minimize or erase evidence of Portuguese brutality. School textbooks were carefully curated. Historical monuments celebrated only the positive aspects of expansion. Albuquerque's letters proposing to attack Mecca were kept in archives where few people would read them. The massacres in Goa were presented as military necessities, not war crimes. The burning of pilgrim ships was either not mentioned or justified as legitimate warfare against an enemy faith. Even after the 1974 Carnation Revolution ended the Salazar dictatorship and Portugal granted independence to its African colonies, this selective historical memory persisted. Democratic Portugal struggled to critically examine its colonial past. Public debates about colonialism often became defensive, with some Portuguese people arguing that Portuguese colonialism had been less brutal than British or French colonialism, or that Portugal had brought civilization and Christianity to African and Asian peoples who supposedly benefited from Portuguese rule. This defensiveness is understandable in some ways. Portuguese people didn't personally participate in colonial atrocities. Most Portuguese people throughout history were poor and had no role in colonial policy. The wealth from colonies enriched the crown, the church, and merchant elites, not ordinary Portuguese farmers or urban workers. So when contemporary Portuguese people are confronted with the brutality of their ancestors' actions in Asia and Africa, they often respond with, That wasn't us, or we weren't responsible for what elites decided centuries ago. These responses are partially valid. Contemporary Portuguese people aren't personally responsible for Albuquerque's actions in 1513, but they do benefit from historical narratives that celebrate Portuguese empire building. While minimizing its violence, they do live in a country whose capital city was enriched by colonial wealth extracted through forced labor, massacres, and economic exploitation. They do have national monuments celebrating colonizers who committed atrocities, and they do have a responsibility to accurately remember that history, rather than selectively forgetting the uncomfortable parts. Some Portuguese historians and intellectuals have tried to promote more critical examination of colonial history. Academic works published since the 1970s have documented Portuguese atrocities in Asia and Africa in detail. Scholars have translated and analyzed Albuquerque's letters, including his proposals to attack Mecca. Journalists have investigated Portuguese colonial wars in Africa and the regime's use of torture against independence movements. These efforts have created a more complete historical record, but this critical scholarship hasn't fully penetrated Portuguese popular consciousness. Most Portuguese people still learn a sanitized version of colonial history in school. The statues of Albuquerque remain in place. Streets keep their colonial names. Public discourse about colonialism often emphasizes Portuguese suffering during decolonization, the loss of empire, and the economic difficulties that followed, rather than the suffering Portuguese colonialism inflicted on millions of people over 5 centuries. This matters because selective historical memory enables contemporary injustice. When Portugal celebrates Albuquerque without acknowledging his atrocities, it sends a message that territorial conquest and economic exploitation are admirable as long as they succeed. When Portugal minimizes colonial violence, it makes it easier to ignore how that violence created lasting inequalities that persist today. Former Portuguese colonies in Africa are among the poorest countries on earth, partly because Portuguese colonial rule extracted wealth without investing in infrastructure, education, or economic development. The Lusophone world's economic and social problems can't be understood without acknowledging the predatory nature of Portuguese colonialism, and the plan to attack Mecca, even though it was never executed, reveals something important about the mindset that drove Portuguese expansion. Albuquerque wasn't proposing to destroy the Kaaba for strategic territorial gain. Mecca wasn't a commercial hub that would give Portugal control over trade routes. It wasn't a military target that would weaken enemy forces. It was purely symbolic, purely about inflicting maximum psychological harm on Muslims as a religious community. The goal was religious humiliation and terror. That's not empire building. That's religious terrorism planned and nearly executed by state actors. If Muslim extremists today propose to attack the Vatican, capture St. Peter's Basilica, destroy the church, and steal the supposed bones of St. Peter to hold for ransom, we would immediately recognize this as terrorism. If they detailed plans to do this during Easter when St. Peter's Square was crowded with pilgrims, massacre as many Christians as possible to maximize the psychological impact, we would call it genocide. If they assembled ships and weapons, and came within miles of executing this plan before being stopped by military force, we would remember it as one of the most dangerous near-miss catastrophes in history. But when a Christian power plans exactly this against Muslim holy sites, it's often presented as an ambitious military proposal by a bold commander that was wisely rejected by cautious leadership. The double standard is obvious. The unwillingness to call Albuquerque's plan what it actually was, a planned religious genocide that came terrifyingly close to execution, reflects ongoing bias in how European colonial history is remembered and taught. This isn't just about historical accuracy for its own sake. This matters because ideas don't die. The religious supremacist thinking that motivated Albuquerque, the belief that one religion justifies any level of violence against another, the conviction that technological superiority grants moral license to commit atrocities, these ideas persist in different forms. When contemporary conflicts involve religious dimensions, when powerful states attack weaker ones while claiming civilizational superiority, when atrocities are justified through othering and dehumanization, we're seeing echoes of the same patterns that drove Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean. Understanding that the Portuguese plan to attack Mecca was serious, detailed, and nearly executed helps us recognize that religious terrorism by state actors isn't just a contemporary phenomenon. It has a long history. European colonial powers routinely used religious justifications for violence that we would now call terrorism. The Portuguese burning pilgrim ships full of civilians, the Spanish forcing indigenous populations to convert or die, the various European crusades and religious wars, all of these fit modern definitions of terrorism, violence against civilians designed to achieve political goals through fear. Recognizing this doesn't mean contemporary terrorism is justified, or that all religions are equally violent. It means acknowledging that the capacity for religious violence exists across religions and across time periods. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, followers of every major religion have at various times committed atrocities justified by religious supremacism. The Portuguese in the Indian Ocean demonstrate that Christians are fully capable of planning and attempting religiously motivated genocide when circumstances enable it. This historical honesty is necessary for preventing future atrocities. If we teach selective history that celebrates empire builders like Albuquerque while minimizing their brutality, we normalize conquest and violence. If we present colonial expansion as a heroic adventure rather than a process built on systematic exploitation and massacre, we make it easier for contemporary powers to repeat similar patterns. If we can't honestly examine our own civilization's capacity for religiously motivated violence, we'll be blind to warning signs when similar patterns emerge in contemporary conflicts. But the Portuguese plan to attack Mecca is particularly revealing because it strips away the fig leaf of civilizing mission that usually covers colonial violence. There's no way to frame attacking the Kaaba during Hajj as anything other than religious terrorism on a massive scale. There's no economic justification sophisticated enough to make sense of destroying Islam's holiest site. It's pure religious hatred weaponized through military superiority. The fact that it didn't happen is due to luck, strategic calculation, and Ottoman military resistance, not because Portuguese leadership had a moral awakening, not because they realized attacking religious sites was wrong, not because they developed respect for Muslim civilization. They simply concluded the consequences would be too severe. If the strategic calculation had been different, if King Manuel had been more of a fanatic and less of a pragmatist, if the Ottomans had been weaker or more distracted by other conflicts, the attack might have proceeded, and the world would have been unrecognizably different, not necessarily better or worse in the long run. Because historical counterfactuals are notoriously unpredictable, but definitely different. The Muslim world's relationship with Christianity would have been even more poisoned than it already was. The Portuguese colonial empire would have collapsed decades earlier. The balance of power in the Indian Ocean would have shifted. The age of European colonial expansion might have taken a different trajectory. Or perhaps not. Perhaps even if Portugal had been destroyed, other European powers would have filled the vacuum. The Spanish, the Dutch, the English, they all eventually followed Portugal into the Indian Ocean. They all committed similar atrocities. They all combined religious supremacy with technological advantage to dominate and exploit. Maybe Portuguese failure would have just meant Spanish or Dutch success, using similar methods. But we can't know because the siege of Mecca never happened. It remained a plan, a possibility, a near-miss catastrophe that came terrifyingly close to triggering a religious war that would have made the Crusades look like minor skirmishes. And perhaps that's the real lesson. History is full of moments where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong but didn't. Not because humanity learned wisdom or developed morality, but because practical considerations and luck intervened at the last moment. The Portuguese didn't attack Mecca because the benefits didn't outweigh Mecca, because the benefits didn't outweigh ever through. That's the reason. Not morality, not respect for religious sites, not recognition of Muslim humanity, just cold calculation that the strategic consequences would be too severe. If that calculation had been different, if the circumstances had aligned differently, then we'd be living in a world where one of Islam's holiest sites had been destroyed by Christian invaders in the 16th century, and the reverberations of that event would still be echoing today. So remember the siege of Mecca that never happened. Remember Afonso de Albuquerque, who planned to destroy the Kaaba and steal the Prophet's body. Remember the Portuguese soldiers who landed within sight of Jeddah, close enough to strike but ultimately turning back. Remember the Ethiopia proposals for joint invasion. Remember the Ottoman fleet that blocked Portuguese expansion into the Red Sea. Remember all the contingencies and decisions that prevented this catastrophe. Remember the atrocities that did happen. The ships burned, The civilians massacred, the religious cleansing the Portuguese commanders committed throughout the Indian Ocean, as part of their broader strategy of which attacking Mecca was just the logical endpoint, because understanding how close we came to historical disaster helps us recognize that peace and coexistence aren't natural states. They're achievements that require constant work and constant choice. The Portuguese had the military capability to attack Mecca. They had commanders willing to plan and execute the attack. They had soldiers ready to carry it out. They had the ships, the weapons, the intelligence, the opportunity. They chose not to attack primarily for pragmatic reasons, calculating that the consequences would be catastrophic for Portuguese interests. That's not inspiring. It's not uplifting. It doesn't give us faith in human goodness or moral progress. But it's honest, and honesty about history, even uncomfortable history, is essential. The Portuguese experience in the Indian Ocean reveals patterns that repeat throughout colonial history and into contemporary times. Technological superiority creates opportunities for exploitation and violence. Religious or ideological supremacism provides justification for atrocities. Economic desperation motivates decisions that rational strategic thinking should prevent. These patterns don't belong to one culture or one time period. They're recurring human failures that show up across civilizations. The specific form changes. Today's technologies and ideologies differ from 16th century galleons and Catholic crusading fervor. But the underlying dynamic remains. Powerful states with technological advantages still exploit weaker populations. Religious and ideological extremism still justifies violence against civilians. Economic interests still override moral concerns. Understanding that the Portuguese nearly attacked Mecca 500 years ago helps us recognize similar patterns in contemporary conflicts, where powerful actors contemplate actions whose immediate benefits blind them to catastrophic long-term consequences. The counterfactual exercise matters. What would have happened if Portugal attacked Mecca? The conclusion that it would have triggered Portugal's destruction isn't speculation. It's based on understanding the strategic situation in the early 1500s, the relative power of Muslim states, the economics of Portuguese empire, and the limits of Portuguese military capability. King Manuel understood this. His advisors understood this. That's why they rejected Albuquerque's plan, despite their religious fanaticism. They could do math. They could see that religious satisfaction would lead to national suicide, but Albuquerque couldn't see it, or more accurately, he chose not to see it because his religious conviction told him God would ensure Portuguese victory regardless of material circumstances. This is the danger of religious zealotry. It creates blindness to reality. It makes rational strategic calculation impossible because faith becomes a substitute for analysis. Albuquerque was brilliant in many ways. His military tactics were innovative. His strategic understanding of how to establish colonial control through fortified ports was sophisticated, but his religious fanaticism prevented him from recognizing the limits of Portuguese power. This matters because similar patterns continue today. Leaders who make decisions based on ideological conviction rather than realistic assessment of capabilities and consequences. Commanders who believe their civilization's superiority guarantees victory. Politicians who start wars they can't win because faith or ideology blinds them to reality. Albuquerque in 1513 isn't so different from other leaders throughout history who've led their nations into catastrophic conflicts through combination of arrogance, supremacism, and refusal to acknowledge limitations. The Portuguese ultimately didn't attack Mecca, but they continued their brutal policies in the Indian Ocean for another century. The systematic destruction of Muslim shipping, the massacres of civilian populations, the religious cleansing of conquered territories, all of this continued long after Albuquerque died. Later, Portuguese commanders were more cautious about triggering total war with the entire Muslim world, but they maintained the same basic strategy of using terror and violence to dominate trade. It worked in the short term, generating enormous profits for the Portuguese crown and merchant class. In the long term, it created hatred that poisoned relations between Christian Europe and the Muslim world for centuries. And that legacy persists. Contemporary conflicts in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia still carry echoes of colonial-era religious warfare. The anger many Muslims feel toward Western powers isn't just about contemporary policies. It's rooted in historical memory of centuries of European colonialism that combined religious supremacism with military violence and economic exploitation. The Portuguese atrocities in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch colonial rule in Indonesia, the British imperial policies in the Middle East and South Asia, the French colonization of North Africa, all of this created wounds that haven't healed. When Western political leaders express surprise that military interventions in Muslim-majority countries face fierce resistance, when they claim not to understand why their proclaimed intentions to bring democracy and development are met with suspicion and hostility, they're revealing either ignorance or deliberate erasure of colonial history. Of course, populations that experienced centuries of exploitation by powers claiming civilizational superiority don't trust new claims of benevolent intervention. Of course, Muslims whose ancestors experienced Portuguese and other European powers planning to destroy their holiest sites have historical memories that shape contemporary attitudes. This doesn't justify contemporary attitudes. This doesn't justify contemporary terrorism or violence. Historical grievances don't make attacking civilians acceptable. But understanding this history makes contemporary conflicts comprehensible in ways that ahistorical narratives can't. The claim that terrorists hate us for our freedom, or that religious extremism is an irrational force divorced from historical context, falls apart when you understand that Portuguese commanders seriously planned to destroy Islam's holiest sites and massacred Muslim civilians as policy for decades. The selective memory matters. The refusal to honestly teach colonial history matters. The siege of Mecca that never happened is ultimately a story about the contingency of history and the importance of strategic calculation in preventing catastrophic religious warfare. It didn't happen not because people suddenly developed moral enlightenment or respect for other religions, but because rational actors concluded the consequences would be unbearable. That's not the lesson we want from history. We want to believe humanity progresses morally, that we learn wisdom through experience, that civilization means developing restraint born from ethical understanding rather than just tactical calculation. But the Portuguese experience suggests otherwise. The same crown that rejected Albuquerque's plan to attack Mecca continued to approve massacres of Muslim civilians elsewhere. The same church that might have been uncomfortable with attacking Islam's holiest sites blessed the Inquisition and the forced conversion of populations throughout Portuguese colonies. The same Portuguese society that produced brilliant navigators and skilled shipwrights also produced commanders who burned ships full of pilgrims. There was no moral progress, just pragmatic decisions about which atrocities were sustainable and which would trigger unmanageable consequences. So the final lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable. Human capacity for religiously motivated violence hasn't disappeared. It's been constrained by strategic calculation, international norms built on mutual recognition that certain provocations trigger responses nobody can survive, and sometimes just luck. But the underlying capacity persists. The technologies change. The specific religions and ideologies shift. The rhetoric updates, but the pattern of powerful actors using religious or ideological supremacism to justify violence against weaker populations continues. Understanding Portuguese plans to attack Mecca helps us recognize this pattern isn't historical curiosity. It's an ongoing human problem requiring constant vigilance and active choice to prevent. Because Albuquerque's plan could be revived in different forms. Not literally attacking Mecca with 16th century galleys and cannons, obviously, but the underlying logic, using violence against religious sites or populations to achieve political objectives, threatening what others hold sacred to extract concessions, planning systematic atrocities against civilians, justified by religious difference. All of this remains possible. The restraints that stopped Albuquerque aren't permanent. They're maintained through choices that each generation must make about whether to pursue short-term religious or ideological satisfaction at the cost of long-term catastrophic conflict.